Hi everyone. Today we are going to touch on topic 2. The topic is materials development for language teaching. Hello teachers. Before I move on to the preamble, let's look at the learning objectives of this chapter 2. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to explain the meaning of materials development, differentiate between the types of materials used in language teaching, discuss the different uses of materials in language teaching, and describe the principles of materials development. For a start, I'm going to talk about the definition of materials development, besides focus on the principles for materials for language learning. This chapter also delves into the development of the field of materials, as well as the production, adaptation, and evaluation of materials for the teaching and learning of language. What is materials development? It refers to all the steps taken by you, the teachers, to produce, adapt, design, evaluate, and research on materials for language teaching and learning. You are aware of the steps to be taken in order to produce or develop your materials so as to facilitate language learning and teaching in the classroom. As such, you play a crucial role in determining the materials to be made and used, taking into consideration of the appropriacy or suitability. The decision, therefore, should be made by you, the teacher. As I mentioned earlier, you play an important part in deciding the suitable materials for your learners. Good materials should be attractive, user-friendly, and responsive to the perceived need of the learners. They are the users. However, even the materials you selected meet the criterion. There's no guarantee that they are effective. McCall in 1984 states that the selected materials for use that the learners respond positively may not prove the value of the materials. The distinctive features of materials within a functional or communicative methodology can be specified by the following terms as advocated by Richards and Rogers in 1986. The materials will focus on communicative abilities of interpretation, expression, and negotiation. This means that the learners have the ability to communicate via interpretation, expression, and negotiation of meaning. These exchanges of information have to be understandable, relevant, and interesting, instead of merely focusing on grammatical form. Materials should involve various kinds of text and media that the learners can use to develop their competence via different activities and tasks. Teachers, please remember that the activities have to be meaningful, fun-filled, and purposeful. What are the types of text and media that we are aware of? Text may include stories, dialogues, simple poems, fables, adventure, folklores, and many more. Well, in this modern society, we can still use the traditional TV and radio besides any social media or games within the media. Teachers, what are the roles of materials? According to Tomlinson in 2001, materials have to be informative, instructional, experiential, eliciting, and exploratory. In order for materials to be informative, please ensure that they inform the learner about the target language. We refer target language here as TL. TL can be any language: English, Bahasa Melayu, Chinese, Tamil, Kadazan, Iban, and so on and so forth. Instructional tends to guide the learner in practicing the language. We instruct the learner to practice the target language. In the case of experiential, it provides the learner with the experience the learner needed about the target language in use. As teachers, we should always elicit or encourage our learner to use the target language. There's really no point of learning without using it? Well, exploratory, we help a learner to explore or to discover about the language. The textbooks in the language classroom, basically there are two types of textbooks, namely traditional textbook and communicative textbook. Traditional textbooks are still being used and published until this point in time, and their main function is to try to get learners to learn the language as a system. The characteristics of traditional textbooks, as pointed out by Grant in 1987, mentioned this. Traditional textbooks emphasize the forms or patterns of language, that is grammar, more than communicative function of the language. They focus on reading and writing activities more than listening and speaking skills or tasks. Traditional textbooks emphasize the importance of accuracy of form. They also focus on the syllabus, and as a result, they tend to focus on examinations. These traditional textbooks attract some teachers, no doubt, as they seem to find that these books are easy to use and highly examination-oriented. Unfortunately, learners who work through these books diligently are either unable or encounter some difficulties in using the language. Communicative textbooks, on the other hand, try to overcome the problem encountered in the traditional textbooks. These books create the opportunities for the learners to use language in the classroom before enabling them to use in real life. The characteristics of these books include putting emphasis on the communicative functions of language as the name applies. These books also try to reflect the learner's needs and interests. They emphasize skills in using the language, and thus they are activity-based. These communicative books usually have a good balance among the four language skills, namely listening, speaking, reading, and writing skills. But they may emphasize listening and speaking skills more than a traditional textbook does. They tend to be very specific in defining their aims. Both contents and methods reflect the authentic language of daily life. Communicative textbooks encourage pair and group work, and therefore may demand more on teachers' organizational abilities. They focus more on fluency than accuracy. Teachers, why do you have to adapt your textbook in your language classroom? Are you aware of the fact that not all the contents of your textbook suit the level of every learner of yours? Therefore, as teachers, we should not use the textbook lock, stock, and barrel or in its entirety. We need to evaluate what works and what does not work for our learners. Ask yourselves further, are they appropriate in achieving all the objectives of the syllabus or the topic of the day? Do all your learners have the same level of language proficiency? As teachers, we need to evaluate the textbook by exploring teachers' and learners' experience and opinions about the book being used. After evaluation, we as teachers have to decide whether to use the textbook without making any changes at all, to adapt it according to the needs of learners. Some learners are weak, so it is best to adapt to our learners' needs and level of competency in the language. As teachers, we can also supplement it if needed. Also, we can create our own materials based on our learners' needs and to create our own materials based on the needs of the syllabus or curriculum. Text can be adapted based on linguistic demands. It's not surprising that we come across difficult texts for young learners. But how do we simplify or adapt the text? A difficult text can be adapted by teachers to enable young learners to learn according to their competency level. For example, the famous fable, The Ant and the Grasshopper. This fable can be adapted to teach our young learners with limited English. Even though it could be quite different from the original text, it can still work for a number of reasons. What are the reasons? Firstly, the story is still a good source for learning new vocabulary, sentence structures, and functions. From the vocabulary point of view, children can learn the names of the insects like grasshopper and ants. From the sentence structure, young learners can learn the past tense form of the verbs in the story, questions and answers in the dialogues between the grasshopper and the ants. What about the function point of view? This adapted fable can still be enjoyed by the young children when they read it or listen to it. This fable is still teachable because it imbues the traditional moral values such as the need to work for food. At times, we need to supplement the existing textbook for some good reasons. By supplementing the textbook, it helps to rectify or improve the weakness of the existing or available textbook. The textbook may not match the syllabus or curriculum or objectives of the teaching and learning. Therefore, the supplementary teaching or learning materials can vary according to the availability of the materials or the creativity of the teachers. Teachers, have you ever created your own teaching learning materials? I'm sure you definitely have. Normally, this will be teachers' last resort when you cannot adapt, or supplement your existing textbooks or authentic texts. Anyway, there should be fundamental basis in order to create your own materials. What are the fundamental bases, by the way? Among others, your teaching objectives or instructional goals, learners' needs, and topic-based planning. In every good practice, there's a good theory or principle to support it. For the principles of materials development, Tomlinson in 1998 suggested the following principles to enhance the development of materials for teaching and learning of language. Materials should be designed and developed to impact learning. How to make learning impactful? This happens when the materials attract the attention of the learners, the materials are of interest to your learners, and this makes your learners curious to learn. If this is attained, there is a better chance that some of the language in the materials will be taken in by your learners for processing. Materials that are impactful can be achieved through the following ways: novelty, variety, attractive presentation. Another principle advocated by Tomlinson is to help learners to feel at ease. These materials can help your learners to feel good in the following ways. Materials which relate to the culture of your learners, that is, culturally relevant. Materials which help your learners rather than testing them. Try to avoid having tests or examination to scare off your learners. Learning should be fun. Materials which do not threaten learners or even humiliate them. So design materials that encourage learners to have their personal voice. Allow them to talk about their points of view using the skills that they have acquired. Materials should help your learners to develop self-confidence. How can you go about it? As teachers, you can use simple language to elicit your learners to accomplish easy tasks. You can guide your learners to go beyond their current proficiency. At the same time, you can encourage your learners to do stimulating tasks or activities. Engage your learners to use their existing skills in completing their task. Materials should be seen by learners as relevant and useful. For instance, If your learners are more interested in writing about their games, whereas others may be keen in writing about their dolls or toys, allow them to do so. In short, materials which are authentic may be considered to be relevant and useful. Materials should also facilitate self-involvement. They should encourage your learners to discover, take responsibility, and make decisions about their language learning. Materials should expose your learners' language in authentic use. Sometimes, partially or unplanned learning activities may stimulate spontaneous responses of your learners. Aren't they interesting and excellent? Materials should also draw the attention of your learners to the linguistic features of input, such as words, simple sentences, and context. This will enable your learners to be more alert when the same linguistic features appear in their future lessons. Materials should provide your learners with the opportunity to communicate in the target language, namely Bahasa Melayu or English. Encourage your learners to speak and use the target language. Materials should take into account the different learning styles and attitudes of the learner. Some learners are visual, whereby they need to see information to process it, while others are auditory learners and they learn through listening. The rest can be kinesthetic or tactile learners, in which learning can only take place by carrying out physical activities. Materials should also maximize learning potential by these three aspects. They are intellectual, aesthetic, and emotional involvement. They stimulate both the right and left brain activities of the learners. This means that the materials can encourage the learners to learn the same lesson involving different cerebral processes and different states of consciousness in many different parts of the brain that will maximize recall. Let's take a look at what authentic materials are. Peacock defined authentic materials as materials that fulfill some social purposes of the language used by the learners. These are the materials that the learners would encounter in their daily lives. For example, materials that are related to their meal times, the playgrounds, the kindergartens, the restaurants they visit, and so on and so forth. Authentic materials provide learners with many significant advantages that help the learners to personalize, localize, make learning fun-filled, purposeful, and meaningful. However, they are not without their drawbacks, such as the complexity of the language. Since it is authentic in nature, it may be too culturally biased or hard to understand outside the language community. The other disadvantages are the learning burden and the unavailability of the authentic target language materials. In addition, learners may face difficulties in understanding the many different accents contained in the materials. Several experts stress that we need to humanize the language learning in order to be effectively engaging and cater for all learning styles preferences. The materials that you have developed or prepared should be evaluated from time to time for improvement. Evaluating materials used for language learning is a process that involves measuring the value or potential value of the learning materials. We have to bear in mind that teaching and learning materials should contain both low and high level skills to make teaching and learning of language a success. Teachers should ask the following questions when evaluating the materials that you have prepared. Are the materials appealing to learners? Are the materials credible? Do the materials relate or match with the syllabus? Are the materials reliable? Do the materials motivate your learners? Do the materials relate to the wants or the needs of your learners? Do the materials help your learners to make connections with their own lives? Do the materials stimulate emotional engagement? And last but not least, do the materials promote visualization?